I recently received the update for traffic lights and stop signs, so I figured I'd do a quick video. If you're not familiar with this update, in short, the car will now stop for traffic lights and stop signs. Started off here on a semi-divided highway, going towards the sun to see what kind of impact that had on the cameras. And it did a really good job. I couldn't detect any issues with it picking up traffic lights. And with this version of the software, it'll stop at all traffic lights, even if they're green. And you'll have to pull on the autopilot stalk in order for the car to continue. The autopilot stalk on the S and the X is on the lower left side of the steering column, where the 3 and the Y, it's built into the drive selector. You can also press on the accelerator to have the car continue moving forward, but I found that that's a little bit harder to control, and the stalk is in a convenient spot. Clearly, Tesla is being cautious with this version of the software, which makes sense since this is a brand new feature and still learning. But it does get a little repetitive, especially if you go through a lot of traffic lights. Now going the opposite direction on the same road, slightly different area, and we'll go into that in a second because there's an interesting change here. But as we come up to the traffic light, you can see it's a little bit harder to see the light that's on, but the car had no problem with detecting that it was a red light. Now, the interesting part, if you look down the lower left, you'll see that the max speed is 45 and the speed limit is 45. When I was coming the other direction, and again, it was in a slightly different area, it was allowing me to go over the speed limit like it does in normal divided highways. But going this direction, it restricted me to the speed limit. And I think this is one of the biggest problems with this version. I wish they had kept the 5 miles per hour over the speed limit. If you're going the speed limit, at least in my area, you're going to be tailgated and you're going to make people very angry. So I found that I was turning the feature off when I wasn't in areas like this where there's multiple lanes where people can go around me. With that said, this is a really cool feature, and I found that it was giving me plenty of warning before traffic lights. Normally about 600 feet is where it would start to show the warning that you'll see in the bottom left hand of your screen. You'll see actually right there it said 600 feet. So I was able to actually pull the autopilot stalk long before it would start slowing down for the traffic light. So I didn't have any issues with it slowing down, putting the brakes on for someone who's behind me, unless I actually missed the message pop up. I'm now coming up to a traffic light where you'll see it prompt me. I clear the message by pulling the stalk, and then it turns yellow, and you'll see that the message pops back up and it stops for the traffic light. It'll continue to stop even if you pull the stalk while it's continuing to approach the traffic light. However, if you pull the stalk while at the traffic light, it will start to go again. Here I tried a lane change while it was coming up to a red light. It completed the lane change with no problems. After I got past this traffic light, I actually switched back over to the right lane, and it continued to complete that one as well. So there really doesn't seem to be any limitations to switching lanes, even when coming up to a traffic light. In this section of the road, there's roads coming in diagonally, and you'll see stop signs along the way. Some of them look like they're kind of facing towards the direction that I'm going. It did well until we came up to this next side street where the stop sign is definitely aimed towards me a bit. And you can see it actually paints a red line on the ground and starts to slow down. I had to pull the stalk several times. It continued to slow down. I'm not sure if it was me pressing the accelerator or if one of the stalk pulls finally let it go. Here's another example of the light changing after I pulled the stalk, and it does a good job of slowing down for these. I was really impressed. If it turns from green to yellow while you're very close, it'll continue to go through, but if there's a comfortable stopping distance, it'll come to a complete stop. Here's an example where I'm coming up to a traffic light and turn autopilot on, and it immediately starts to slow down. I wish it would allow you to continue to go through if you've enabled autopilot that close to a traffic light. I mentioned earlier that it is limited to the speed limit, but it does appear, and you can see here that I'm pressing on the accelerator to push it above the speed that it's set at, and autopilot continues to function, so that's similar to previous versions. I found a nice neighborhood with painted lines and lots of stop signs, but that's when things started to go a little bit south. I'm coming around this corner and you can see that there's cars parked on the side of the road. And it's hard to tell, but as I come up to this, it looks like it's going to clear it with no problem. Right when I get to the cars, it swerves towards the cars and I had to take over. I turned autopilot right back on, but you can see as I came up to this car, it threw an alert again. It seemed to be having a hard time determining where the edge of the road is, and you can kind of see the line bouncing around and cars either being inside or outside of that line. So even with traffic aware cruise control on only, it was having trouble with the cars that were on the side of the road. It did come to a full stop at this stop sign, so no issue there. But like I said, I was in traffic aware cruise control here versus full autopilot. I tried autopilot a few more times in this neighborhood, but unfortunately it just continued to have problems with the cars that were parked on the shoulder, and it would either come to a complete stop or get close to them and throw an alert. So I had to move on to a new area. With that said, I think I've found the new area for a portion of the test loop to see how autopilot progresses with this type of issue. As I was leaving the neighborhood, I did find a stop sign that was free of cars, and it did come to a nice smooth stop. And you'll see here in the message in the bottom left of your screen that it'll tell you to pull the autopilot stalk or press on the accelerator. And when I did, it crossed the road with no problems until, of course, it came to this car, and you'll see that it had me take over immediately. Just like traffic lights, it appears they're using GPS data for stop signs. As you can see here, the message popped up long before I could see the stop sign coming up. Here's another example of an upcoming stop sign, and it pops up the message long before I can see it. You'll see in the lower left, the red line will kind of hover and then slide into where the stop sign is as it kind of figures itself out. It's an interesting integration between the reality of what the cameras see and the GPS data that it's using. Here's an example with a traffic light that's around a corner, but it shows the message before we get there. Unfortunately, it didn't slow down for this corner, so I had to take over before I got to the traffic light. Next, I moved into a small kind of downtown area that has some traffic lights, some crosswalks with some folks moving through them, as well as cars parked on the side of the road to see how it reacted. Unlike the neighborhood, it seemed to be able to get around these cars parked on the side of the road, even though they didn't have lines where they were parked. It did tend to slow down, and it did this gently. It didn't like slam on the brakes like it did in the neighborhood and come to a stop, but it would slow down to, below what I have it set to. So I had it set to 25, and it would go down to about 20. Just like the other areas, it was able to detect the traffic lights long before you could see them. And it seemed to navigate this little city area very well. You'll see as we come up to this traffic light that there's a car that's kind of parked outside the lines on the side of the road here. And though it got a little uncomfortably close to it, it didn't really seem to affect it, but again, like it did in that neighborhood. In this area, there were several crosswalks with signs for them in the middle of the road. And it did a good job of slowing down for folks and navigating around the little barriers in the center of the road. No issues, didn't get close to them. I wasn't really concerned at all. I did reduce the speed to 20 miles an hour, which I thought was a little bit more appropriate for this area anyway. But again, it navigated quite well, even with cars on the side of the road, whether they were in the lines or outside the lines. It did a pretty good job. It got a little close to the cars. I mean, I would probably hug the center lane a little bit more, but not too bad. coming up as an example of where it gets very close to parked cars. This truck is over the line, and I would think it would move over a little bit, but it doesn't. Now, there was still a good foot of clearance there, but I would still prefer that it moves over a bit. Hopefully, with future updates, that'll happen. So that's the traffic lights and stop sign update and its current state. I'm sure that they'll continue to make iterative improvements with this. It'll be interesting to see how this progresses. I'm pretty impressed. I do hope that the next update allows for the speed to be set about 5 miles an hour above the actual posted speed limit, just from ironically, a safety perspective. But other than that, I think it's pretty cool. And again, I'm really interested to see where Tesla goes with this. Very impressive. Thanks for watching.